Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming to our talk. He's already introduced us, so I won't bore you with that, but we're from Proofpoint and Threatray. And this talk is about some joint collaborative research between Proofpoint and our friends at Threatray. The motivation behind this presentation and paper was that all public research that we could find about TA397 or BITR would attribute the activity to a South Asian threat actor. We thought that, enough is enough. Let's take attribution all the way. So this talk is a quick story of how we did that. And if you want more detail, I highly recommend going to read the paper in our blogs. So for a quick run through of the agenda, this is what you'll be hearing about today. When you hear us talk about TA397 or BITR, we'll use those terms interchangeably. Just know we're talking about the same threat actor. So we're going to cover some of the campaigns that we see in Proofpoint's telemetry, the infection chains, some juicy hands-on keyboard activity that we saw from the threat actor, and then dive into some timestamp analysis that helped us in our attribution. And then we'll hand it over to our friends at Threatray to talk about the payloads that we see from them, the malware, the shared TTPs across their arsenal, and then tie it all together with some attribution. So before we get into the actor, I wanted to touch just really briefly on our attribution methodology. It includes many common elements that everyone else here uses for attribution, I'm sure. And there are elements that are specific to email-based campaigns that we find particularly useful, like the content of the email, the volume of messages, delivery techniques, and the targets themselves, of course. So on that note, let's look at how we characterize TA397. Obligatory diamond model, because defining a cluster is important, and we're good analysts. So when you hear us talk about TA397, like I said, or BITR, they're the same thing. At a high level, this is how Proofpoint views TA397 activity. Capability-wise, on the right, we see delivery of payloads that set up a specific structure of scheduled tasks with a huge preference for CHM files or compiled HTML files as a means to deliver those scheduled tasks, and primarily the usage of C++ or .NET RATs. Infrastructure-wise, they're actually quite sophisticated in how they set it up, making tracking somewhat difficult on a pure infra-characteristic basis. However, from an email perspective, we see the usage of compromised government addresses, free mail accounts, and their initial first-stage infrastructure is almost exclusively hosted with Let's Encrypt certificates. From our visibility, the vast majority of the targeting is against government and diplomatic organizations, but we also see some defense and some energy vertical targeting as well. So let's dive into some of their campaigns and see what their fish actually looks like. Here's a smattering of some of the lures and emails that we've observed in use by TA397 throughout the last year. We've seen topical themes discussed that align with current events, as you can see with the reference to the imposition of martial law in South Korea this year, for example. We've seen fake documents created and attached to emails as decoys to attempt to show legitimacy and inspire urgency, as you can see on the bottom right. But on a more boring note, the majority of the emails that we see from TA397 are like the ones in the top right. Short, spoofing a government or diplomatic organization, and a single malicious attachment or URL. So what infection chain does that attachment or URL kick off? Right here. I want to highlight first and foremost that TA397 has demonstrated an ability to experiment with novel infection chains in order to bypass detections or exploit vulnerabilities. They've tried various methods for dropping or creating a scheduled task. However, the scheduled task itself remains largely unchanged. The file types used to initiate scheduled tasks via CMD or PowerShell are primarily CHM, as I said, but we've also seen them use MSCs, LNKs, MS Access files, and even your more esoteric file types like IQYs and Search Connector MS files, all within a RAR or a zip archive to make detection a little bit more difficult. We've also seen the usage of actor-owned infrastructure URLs to drop those malicious files that set up those scheduled tasks. But as you can see in the diagram, there's only ever experimentation on everything to the left of the scheduled task and everything on the right, i.e. the payloads that they drop. That scheduled task just doesn't change. So that also might have been the motivation behind this paper a little bit. We want them to try something new. Make our jobs fun. So on that note, I'll pass it to Konstantin.
Okay, thank you. So the scheduled tasks, as Nick said, it's the one pattern TA397 is utilizing consistently for years, and they never changed it because it's apparently very impactful. Task Scheduler, or formerly known as Scheduled Tasks, is a job scheduler in Microsoft Windows that launches computer programs or scripts at predefined times or after specific time intervals, which is the definition from Wikipedia. So on the example on the slide, you can see the scheduled task is trying to use PowerShell via conhost to beacon every 16 minutes to the C2 to wait and retrieve further commands. It's using a specific PHP URI pattern, and it sends out the computer name and the username to the C2. You can also see the Windows PowerShell user agent, and as Nick mentioned, sometimes we've also seen curl, so then there would be the curl user agent. There are many examples at the bottom of the slide, and you can see the delimiter between the computer name and username changes, but the overall pattern stays constant. So with that, it's hard to create a solely network signature, a suricata or snort signature for this pattern without false positives, due to the change in the delimiter and the variable of the computer and usernames, obviously. But on the host, in a sandbox environment or in your enterprise environment, it's pretty straightforward to detect it, as you can predict or know the patterns of your computer names, or you have a schema that they are following. So you take the scheduled task, you take the PHP URI pattern, you take the computer name and username exfil, and if that's not enough, you can additionally check the C2 domain certificate. It's usually a Let's Encrypt certificate valid for 90 days and a wildcard for the domain. And you take that all together and you can always attribute it to TA397. So what comes after the scheduled tasks? As I said, the scheduled task beacons every 16 minutes, and that's something we can't run in our production environment with the sandbox. So we have to manually run this and pull the payload to retrieve further information on the campaigns, the actor, and their infrastructure. Bitter's fencing is pretty intense, but we have a not-to-be-named expert in our team in whose office that bare metal laptop sits, and it's providing us with the juice for this research. In general, we try to mimic an authentic profile, run the malicious file that starts the scheduled task, and then we wait and sit. And usually we only have to wait and sit until the India daytime working day starts, and then we retrieve further payloads and more commands. By doing this, we expand our knowledge on the threat actors, their TTPs, their victimology, and we can also sharpen our attribution. I think because we use payloads that have been seen in real-world email campaigns almost on the same day, our success rate to retrieve the next stage payloads and commands is pretty high. On that slide, you see an exemplary answer to such a scheduled task. In this case, they mount a network share to copy and execute the next stage payload on our infected machine. And I'm going to repeat that: they mount a network share. It's like connecting an external hard drive to your machine via the internet. So it's bidirectional, which means we also have access to the whole share. And you find a lot on it. The command from the screenshots are from just 2 days ago, and because obviously we've seen them when we were traveling to VB, and you can see there have been many documents on the share, and we suppose that those are exfiltrated documents from victims. Analysis is obviously ongoing. In our paper and blog, you will find more examples of this, because it's also not the first time they mount an external share, and we were able to analyze some of those documents already. So what else do we have besides the documents when we get access to such a share? Obviously, we have timestamps. So timestamp analysis has been a proven good way to support attribution, and it's also always telling a story. So how do we use this hands-on keyboard activity and all the infrastructure data, for example, from these two domains we have, to help us with the question of attribution? We look at various timestamps. We took all the observed timestamps from the hands-on keyboard activity, from known C2 infrastructure, and we plotted that data onto a few different heat maps. And when you adjust the timeline on the x-axis to the Indian Standard Time Zone, you can start to see a pretty clear pattern that emerges. So in this slide, you can see the hands-on keyboard activity at the top and the passive DNS first seen timestamps on the bottom. On the next slide, we have Let's Encrypt certificate creation date at the top and who is domain creation date at the bottom. And finally, if we put them all together, we can see a clear pattern of focused activity that falls squarely into a 9-to-5 working day of India. So those are, of course, there are quite a few outliers, and those are primarily from passive DNS and certificate data, but those aren't 100% reliable because those timestamps also have influence when server register and propagate information over the internet. For example, the first seen date of passive DNS is when you first visit the domain, so this could also have a slightly delay in time. Obviously, that's because we use a combination of all the data sources, and we've given the hands-on keyboard activity timestamp a slightly more weight, and this leads to the picture on the slide. So I will hand it over to Jonas for talking about their payload arsenal.
Thank you very much. So in the second part of this talk, we will focus our attention on Bitter's very comprehensive payload arsenal and how that has evolved over all of these years. And that's a picture we can draw from a study of available open source intelligence on the actor, which spans all of these years, however also on some more recent payloads that weren't reported and we analyzed in more detail. What you can see here is the overview of their arsenal. It's in total around 11 malware families, and we will now look a little bit closer at how they evolved over time. We will see some shared TTPs that we can observe over this arsenal, and then later on we will also do a deep dive into 4 of these more recent malware families and how they changed and what they're used for now. Overall, Bitter's payload development can be split into 3 phases. So in the beginning, in the early years, from 16 to 20, we saw mostly a very simplistic download and execute pattern. So the workhorse there was primarily Artra downloader. And then in the mid stages, we see this kind of ramp up of more advanced capabilities. So notably, there's MUI downloader, which is basically the replacement for Artra, and is still active to this day with various iterations. We then also saw the emergence of BDark Rat, which was their first .NET Rat, Almond Rat as their second .NET Rat, and we then also have WM Rat, which is still used to this day, and RPC Backdoor, which we will hear of a little bit more later on. In more recent years, we also saw the emergence of Mia Rat, which is their most complete rat to date. They also started adopting some very purpose-built tooling. So there's Kugelblitz, which is just a simple shellcode loader, as well as Kiwi, again, a very simple loader that they started to use. So one observation from this arsenal is that they clearly prefer their own homegrown tooling. They also keep that tooling very simplistic. So the main complexity in their attacks is in the first stages, infection chain, hands-on activities. Once they get through that stage, it's very simple. That also means there is very little information in the payloads themselves which would aid the direct attribution of this actor. There are, however, some nice shared TTPs across this arsenal, which ties this tool set to a common actor. and therefore, of course, in combination with the other aspects, also aid the attribution. These are now a couple of shared TTPs that we're going to take a closer look at. And one extremely prevalent shared TTP is how they do information gathering. So here we can see 3 different malware families from the earliest to present days and how they implement their information gathering. So here we can see that they are collecting a computer name. Then they collect OS information, as well as at the end some username. Very same structure. This is something you find in pretty much every payload, and that's one of the first things they do, which they also then submit to the C2 server. A second pattern that we can observe is their use of obfuscation, mostly for strings and configs. Here again, for examples from different malware families, so we can see in rats, downloaders, and backdoors equally that they are using very simple character addition and subtraction for this obfuscation pattern, so that's one of their key pieces of obfuscation overall. And then in later stages, they also adopted a very simplistic XOR encryption, usually in combination with a custom key that they supply, and that is in C, C++, as well as .NET code, clearly visible here, very simplistic. Lastly, on that note, in the 2.NET rats, we can also observe that they started using AES encryption for mostly config encryption, and if you squint your eyes, you can see this is basically exactly the same code. The last shared TTP that we observed is there are very often slight code variations between the variants of a specific malware family. So MUI Downloader is a very good example here. You can see these 3 different variants from 3 different years, and this is about how to format the payload. So the payload we saw beforehand is gathered from computer name, username, and OS information, and you can see how this is concatenated in a slightly different manner. Of course, still exactly the same stuff and semantics, but slight variation. We can also see that in a second example here on MiaRat, again 3 variants implementing string decryption, a very simple string decryption mechanism, slightly different variations of their implementation, and these kind of pattern variations of the implementation we can also observe over a good part of their payload dataset. Good, and with that we covered a bit an overview of the arsenal and some shared TTPs that we observed, and in the next part I'll hand it over to Abdallah.
Thank you. Okay, so as you already saw, the arsenal of this threat actor is quite diverse, and we will deep dive into 4 of these tools in this part. So the first family is bdarkrat, which was first seen in 2019 and still used in 2025. This rat has been given several names, such as Splinter Rat and Turtle Power, and this is likely due to varying .NET namespaces found in different samples in the wild. But based on our research and jumping through multiple OSINT resources, we believe that bdarkrat is likely the most accurate name, as it turned out to be based on Dark Agent Rat, which is an open source rat that was first published in hack forums in 2010, then it was later made public in GitHub in 2011. Although the earlier variants of bdarkrat have been identical to Dark Agent Rat, which is the open source rat, we have seen continuous development from better, and that includes shifting from descriptive C2 commands to numerical values, and also with extended functionalities such as screen capture and PowerShell command execution. We also observed the shift from hex-encoded C2 addresses to using AES-256 encrypted C2 addresses, and then they shifted back in recent samples to hex-encoded C2 addresses. The second family we are talking about is MUI Downloader, which was first seen in 2021. And interestingly, we found a recent sample in 2025 during our research time. MUI Downloader has also been known as ZXX, Z Downloader, and it's considered to be the successor of Ultra Downloader, as Jonas said. It has been known to drop a handful of better tools, such as simple keylogger, bdarkrat, and almondrat. It also uses simple character addition and subtraction, or XORing for string encoding, which is similar to other families in the better arsenal, as you already saw. What makes actually Movie Downloader unique, and that's actually what helped us to identify a recent variant of it in 2025, is their implementation of the payload retrieval. It starts by getting the payload name from the CTOS server, then it builds the payload path and appends the extension .exe to the payload file name. Next, it downloads the payload, but the payload is actually missing the first PE header byte, which is the 4D byte. That's actually likely to evade network detection. And then that missing byte is appended to the payload bytes before writing it to disk and then executing it. The third family is Miarat, first seen in 2024 and also still active this year. It collects system information and appends a hard-coded version number, which allows us to track its evolution. Then it concatenates this data using a pipe character and sends it to the C2 server. And the C2 address embedded is actually decoded using simple character subtraction. And we saw a recent variants employing XOR encryption using single byte key for the C2 communications, which is very simple and also known from Bitter. And in the most recent variant, which is version 5, found by Proofpoint, we saw through our code similarity that it's very similar to the older variants, but there was actually an interesting change that we saw, which is that the C2 command strings were obfuscated in an obfuscated format, and this would likely make some string-based error rules fail to detect that new variant. And lastly, the last family we were talking about is ORPC backdoor. It's a simple backdoor seen in 2022. It implements the basic C2 functionality, such as screen share, collecting screenshots and these kind of stuff. And it communicates with the C2 server using RPC protocol. The C2 commands and other strings are encoded using simple hex encoding, but the interesting thing with that backdoor is that it has been reported to be used by another threat actor in the same region in 2023 called Mysterious Elephant, or APTK47. And that brings us to the final attribution notes.
So, attribution. TA397, we assess as an espionage-focused threat actor that highly likely operates on behalf of an Indian intelligence organization. They primarily target government and defense organizations in Asia, but also Europe, with a particular focus on entities with relations or interests in China, Pakistan, and other neighboring countries on the Indian subcontinent. Interestingly, we never see activity targeting India. There's also a clear indication that most infrastructure-related activity, as well as the hands-on keyboard activity, occurs during the standard business hours in the IST time zone. Now, if you'll indulge me, we also have a bonus slide to highlight how actually all of our work on publishing intel on espionage groups does and can have an impact. Now, guys, look, I'm not saying this was us, but I'm also not saying it wasn't. We've seen a massive drop-off in the volume of campaigns since we made this research public, to the point where there were extended periods of times where we just didn't see them at all. However, this slide also aged like milk, because of course we saw them pop up 2 days ago, after not seeing them for 2 months. So yeah, maybe don't put a slide like this on your slides. Don't worry, it is more scheduled tasks, they haven't changed, so yay, I guess. Thanks for coming to our talk. We'd love to answer any questions if you have any. Thanks.